Tonight, we are talking about kings, not the feasting, jousting, waving from a balcony kind. We are talking about the ones history took one long look at and said, you know what? Not but the kings who inherited thrones like they were inheriting a termite-infested house with a cursed well and a secret dungeon. Nobody mentioned men who were handed crowns, scepters, and the keys to entire kingdoms, only to discover that absolute power comes with absolutely catastrophic consequences. Imagine that. But the job is running a country. The office is a castle full of people who want you dead. And the performance review is whether or not you keep your head. Congratulations! You have just woken up as a king. The crown is heavier than it looks. The throne is colder than you expected. And somewhere in the shadows of this palace, history is already sharpening its pen. Let us start at the very beginning, which for most of these kings is also where things went wrong. Some men are born unlucky. Some are born into unlucky families. And then there are the kings who managed both simultaneously, arriving into dynasties already teetering on the edge of collapse. Take the heirs who arrived not just to a throne, but to an inheritance of debt, scandal, rebellious nobles, foreign enemies, starving peasants, and, as a bonus, the ghost of a more successful predecessor whose portrait was still hanging in every great hall, staring down with quiet disapproval. These were the princes raised on the promise of greatness, tutored in warfare and statecraft, groomed from infancy to rule, only to discover on coronation day that the kingdom they would been prepared for no longer resembled the one they actually received. The map had changed. The allies had shifted. The money was gone. And nobody had thought to update the curriculum. Coronation Day was supposed to be the moment. The soaring music, the kneeling nobles, the sense that God himself had penciled your name into the ledger of history. And for many of these kings, it started beautifully. The robes were magnificent. The ceremony was flawless. And then, almost immediately, walls started closing in. Some kings arrived at their own coronations already compromised, propped up by factions who had no intention of letting them actually rule. Others found that the moment they accepted the crown, enemies who had been politely waiting rushed the board like someone had flipped the chess table. The coronation was not a beginning. It was a countdown for the most cursed coronation kings. The ceremony itself was the high point of the reign. Everything that followed was a long, complicated, increasingly desperate attempt to hold on to something that had already started slipping away in the cathedral. One of the crueler ironies of royal history is that some kings spend their entire childhoods being told they would one day hold absolute power, only to discover that someone else was running everything. Enter the regency, that elegant arrangement where a child king technically holds the title, while a parent, uncle, or extremely ambitious grandmother holds everything else on paper. It was protective. In practice, it was a master class in power being exercised in someone else's name. Reclaiming actual control from a regent was not just politically complicated, it was dangerous. Regents did not tend to retire gracefully. They would spend years accumulating influence, building networks, and making themselves indispensable. And the king, who decided he was finally ready to govern, often found that readiness alone was not enough, and that the gap between wearing a crown and wielding one was the size of an ocean. Nothing dissolves royal authority quite like being broke. And a surprising number of histories, most cursed kings, inherited thrones that came with something unexpected tucked into the royal treasury. Absolutely nothing, or worse, debt. Spectacular, generational, somehow still growing debt. Running a kingdom without money is roughly equivalent to trying to host a dinner party with no food, no kitchen, and guests who are already angry about the last dinner party. You need money to pay soldiers. You need soldiers to enforce laws. You need laws to collect taxes. And you need taxes to get money. Break any single link in that chain and the whole thing collapses. The broke king's options were limited and uniformly unpleasant. Raise taxes and risk rebellion. Borrow and create creditors. Sell offices and permanently reduce your own power. Or debase the coinage and watch trust in your government evaporate entirely. Some kings did not inherit disaster. They rode out to meet it personally on horseback with banners flying and a battle plan that made complete sense until the moment it did not. History is littered with kings who launched wars they could not win at times. They could not afford against enemies they had dramatically underestimated. The worst of these were the kings who were personally present for the disaster. There is something particularly unforgiving about a king who survives a catastrophic defeat and has to ride home to face the people who trusted him with their sons, their taxes, and their future. A dead king at least gets a somber epitaph. A living one who lost badly has to keep showing up to court while everyone in the room tries very hard not to make eye. The aftermath moved through a kingdom in waves. Territory lost, soldiers dead, authority shattered, and underneath it all, the current of personal grief from families who knew specifically what his decisions had cost them. Every royal family eventually arrives at a king who should not, by any reasonable measure, have been king. Not because he was cruel, not because he was weak, but because something in the architecture of his mind made the job genuinely impossible. The tragedy of the Mad King is not just personal, it is structural. A kingdom needs someone at the top making decisions. When the person at the top cannot reliably make decisions, everyone beneath him compensates. Councils overreach, favorites accumulate too much power. Enemies abroad sense the weakness. The court folds itself around the problem, the way tissue paper folds around something fragile. Carefully, with great effort, and with a constant nagging awareness that it is not actually a solution. Meanwhile, the king himself was still there, inside whatever the crisis was doing to him, a person experiencing a complete loss of the mental architecture they needed to function, while surrounded by people who needed them to function and could not say so directly. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs exclusively to kings, the realization, usually arriving too late, that every single person smiling at you has something they want from you and a plan for what to do if they do not get it. The unluckiest kings discover this not from books, but from personal experience, usually in the middle of a crisis when they needed allies most. And of all the indignities history has inflicted on kings, few are as quietly surreal as the prisoner king, the monarch who technically held a throne while physically held in a room he could not leave. The ransom king, captured in battle, dragged off to a foreign court, held hostage while his kingdom scrambled to raise a sum of money that made everyone at home feel slightly ill. Some captured kings were kept in genuine comfort. Good food, good accommodation, a kind of gilded inconvenience that was pleasant in every respect except the locked door. There is a particular weight that settles onto a king who is the last of his line, who knows the dynasty ends with him. These kings inherited not just a throne, but an obligation to a lineage stretching back generations, to the portraits staring down from the walls, to the graves of ancestors who had built what he was now somehow supposed to preserve and pass on. By the time the last king arrived, the machinery he was supposed to operate was already damaged in ways that could not be fixed in a single reign. He was not just governing a kingdom, he was managing a decline, trying to hold together something that had already, in the most important ways, come apart, and doing so with the full knowledge that whatever he managed to preserve would end with him anyway. The portraits in the Great Hall were going to end with his portrait. And after that, different portraits, different faces, a different name above the door. The most unlucky kings were, in many ways, the most historically useful ones, not despite their failures, but because of them. The kings who lost to their nobles, who were forced to sign documents limiting their own authority, gave their kingdoms something that successful kings never provided: written guarantees. The Magna Carta of 1215, extracted from a king at his weakest, turned out to contain principles that outlasted everyone in the room. The unlucky king signed it because he had no choice. The document survived because it said things people in subsequent centuries found they needed said. The king's disaster became the foundation of something that still stands. They did not know they were contributing to that. They were just trying to hold on. But the wreckage of their reigns became the foundation of something better. So tonight, spare a moment for the unlucky kings, the ones whose portraits hang in the secondary rooms of museums. They were real. The pressure was real. The loneliness was real, and the world they left behind was still a world that learned something from them. Sleep well.